Hi, welcome back. This is going to be the part one of the lesson on row restriction as it pertains to date time columns. I want to make a correction to something I said in the last lecture video related to nulls. I said I didn't have a lesson per se, and what I meant to say is I didn't have a formal exercise pertaining to working with nulls, and that we'd roll it into the exercise sets that's related to this subject matter. Alright, let's get into the topic here, working with date and time columns. And what we will choose for the first table we're going to work with on that subject is we'll pick the patient account table and we'll select the first 1,000 rows. And you can see I've got start date and end date that, if we look at, are both date time columns. So our mission here is, how do we do row restriction against date and time columns? Before we get started, I want to talk about just the importance of working with date and time columns. Probably one of the most fruitful and most important thing that you learn regarding querying a database and doing row restriction is really being able to manipulate date and time columns. So much of data within databases and within tables really is date and time centric if you think about it. For example, I'm looking at a point of sale system that I need to query. I might want to see what are my sales for a given day. Well, I'm going to be looking at row restriction against a date and time column to get that information. I might want to even get further granular and say, what are my peak business times? So I want to find out sales within a given time frame, maybe every hour, or what are my sales in the morning versus what are my sales in the afternoon. If I'm working with a scheduling application, I might need to query and pull all of my appointments for the morning or for the afternoon. So there's just, if you just consider the possibilities, there's just a plethora of things that you're going to need to do in querying a database where date and time, understanding how to restrict date and time, are going to be critical to the work that you do in SQL. So with that said, let's kind of jump into the nitty-gritty of doing things. The first thing I'm going to show you how to do is query against the date itself, and query using a date range. So I'm going to show you how to query on a date range, and this will have application in a number of areas for us. So for example, looking at this data set, let's say I wanted to return all of the rows for where the start date is in the month of March 2007. So how I would do that is I would say where my start date field, but I'm going to precede that with a date function. Now I want to stop for a minute and talk about that. If we look at the date time column, you'll notice that it really is composed, since it's a date time field, of two pieces, the date field and the time field. Further, if you analyze the data, you'll see that the time field is empty. There is no time entered. It only has a date entered in it. What the date function does for me is it allows me to isolate within a date time field the specific portion that I want to look at. And in this case, I'm only seeking to return the data for March. So I'm going to say where the start date and time is greater than or equal to. So I believe this is the first time I'm introducing you to this operator. I've shown you the greater than operator before, working against numbers. We're going to use the greater than or equal operator, and within single quotes, so in that sense it's date and time fields, you manipulate them in your row restriction in a similar way that you would a character field. Is greater than or equal to 2007 March and March 1st. And since we're doing a range, we'll say and I'm just going to cut and paste this. And say less than or equal to March 31st. And if we run this, this will return all of the rows for the month of March 2007. Now, some of you that may be coming and have some knowledge already, a little bit of knowledge about SQL, may be asking, why would you use a date and time field, a date timestamp, when you have no intention of populating the time field? And that's a reasonable question. If we go look at the actual data types that are available, and I'm out at my site sqlinfo.net, we can see that you can create the following data types you can have in MySQL. So you can have there's a date time field, there's a date field, a time field, and a timestamp field. Well, why, if there was no intention of adding time, why is a date timestamp? That's a good question. In my experience, I've seen there's certain schools of thought. Some DBAs, for standardization on data types, will just say we're going to use date time field for everything, even if we only plan on putting time in it or just date in it. We're going to use everything. And so in this particular database, that's the mantra that they used for creating, for determining how to deal with date and time columns. They just decided for everything, irrespective, we're going to use a date time field just for consistency. And whether you subscribe to that or don't subscribe to that, we could have that debate at some other time. So if we have a look at this, this is, you've actually learned quite a bit here already just with this lesson. You've learned how to do a range for date, but you've learned actually a little bit more than that. If we wanted to see everything after this particular date and time, well, we could just remove this. I'm just going to do a Control-X to take it out. And if I run it, well, I'm getting everything after or equal to this date returned back. I'm going to do a Control-Z to put it back in. And I can do the same thing. So I could get something before a date, after a date, or a date range. One last thing to show you in this part of the lesson, I can also use the date function up in the select. So for example, let's say we want to select account num, and to make this short, we'll just pick start date. We'll just use start date. If I run this as is, you see I'm getting the full date back. Well, typically the time, since it's not populated, it just represents noise, and I might want to bring back in the record set anyway just the date portion. So I can apply the date function up above, and you'll see I'll get just the date back. Conversely, and you'll also notice that the label comes back with the actual function applied. So in a case where you're adding a function up in the select, you'd want to use an alias name for the column. So I'll just give it the same alias name as the column itself. Okay, that concludes part 1 of the datetime lesson as applied to row restriction. Stop, take a break, and then head off to lesson number 2. I'll see you there. Bye.